Well, good afternoon, everyone. Building on the topic that Buddy brought up, and thank you very much, Buddy, for doing a great job talking about Smart Irrigation Month. I want to speak to some of the specific items that we can do to improve our application efficiency out there in the field, and talk a little bit about the ways that the industry has evolved and developed products and methodologies to deliver water where it's needed, when it's needed, in a very highly uniform fashion. To put things in perspective, I wanted to begin with this quote: "All the water that will ever be is right now." If you noticed in the earlier survey question, there's some question about, there was a question in there about how much water there is in the Earth's atmosphere. And it's important to recognize that the amount of water that's in the Earth's atmosphere does not change. It is static. And over time, we just continue to be one little pod where this water makes a stop in the hydrologic cycle. The things that we do with our irrigation systems and with our landscapes can have a profound effect on water quality and quantity as far as keeping it available where we need it, when we need it. So as you go about conducting your business and offering service to the general public or managing your own irrigation systems, it's important to understand that we are dealing with a finite resource that continues to pass through a cycle. And if you go back to your 4th grade elementary education, you'll learn about that hydrologic cycle, and there are things that you can do to improve the water situation. There are also things that can take away from the water situation. And certainly, landscape irrigation has the ability to provide a lot of solutions that you're going to learn about here today on this webinar. To put things in perspective, the landscape industry has traditionally placed a high priority on appearance. We spend an inordinate amount of time, some of us do, trying to keep up our appearances out there in the field. And we want to have a very nice-looking property. We want to have that curb appeal. And there is a certain status that is associated with having a healthy, vigorous, and lush landscape. But over time, we're seeing an evolution take place, and there's a lot of scrutiny on the industry right now. It's important to recognize that landscape irrigation uses more than 7 billion gallons of water per day nationwide. This is a statistic that EPA came up with back in 2007 in some conversation. That is a significant amount of water. Some even say that amount of water might be underestimated. There are those also, in building on Buddy's topic, saying that you might be able to save half, maybe 90% of the water that's applied to your landscape through the deployment of specific technologies. But on average, a lot of folks suggest that as much as half of the water applied to the landscape is wasted. How is it wasted? Runoff, deep percolation, delivery of water to non-target, such as sidewalks, streets, buildings, etc. Much of this water, unfortunately, is treated drinking water. And let's face it, a little bit later on in Tom Barrett's presentation, you're going to hear about some of these alternative sources. The landscape just doesn't necessarily need to have treated drinking water applied. So, having said that, think about the implications of wasting water that might be otherwise used for drinking, cooking, sanitation. When you get into a press time, certainly the folks in North Carolina, you all know that landscape water use is often deemed an unessential use, particularly in times of stress on the supply. Certainly North Carolina went through that. Georgia went through that back in 2002. Colorado went through a significant period of time where landscape water use was deemed unessential. Unfortunately, we're beginning to learn that when we actually shortchange the landscape in these situations, or haven't come up with creative solutions to some of our water supply problems, we start to lose that tree canopy, and we start to lose those ecological services that are often overlooked and not necessarily recognized. Certainly, when we get into the construction, and obviously with the economic downturn, it hasn't been as big of an issue lately, but certainly in the construction process, builders and landscapers often look at an irrigation system as a nuisance rather than an opportunity. The irrigation system is simply a tool to facilitate healthy plants. And many times we don't necessarily afford the irrigation system the type of attention it deserves. And I think that there's also an awareness problem in that a lot of folks don't really recognize how far we have moved the needle in advancing the technology that's available and the solutions that we provide collectively as an industry. Because of that, oftentimes in green building, in the green building movement, there are credits available oftentimes to just eliminate irrigation entire project. As one who represents the irrigation industry, I find that a little bit unfortunate because I consider the irrigation system to be a tool in the toolbox to help facilitate healthy plant growth. Knowing that, tools can be used appropriately or they can be misused. And we have a long way to go in making sure that irrigation systems are used appropriately. Certainly, as we look forward to a future with more and more pressure on the resources that we have to deal with, and certainly with an aging infrastructure in this country, we have some serious challenges that we need to live up to. Taking a quick snapshot, looking beyond the appearance, obviously oftentimes the trigger for folks to buy an irrigation system is that appearance, the status, the lush green appearance. But looking beyond that appearance factor, it's important to understand that there's a certain amount of bioremediation that takes place. In other words, we're removing pollution. There's dust abatement that takes place, noise abatement. Certainly soft green plants don't echo and reflect noise like hard surface and concrete and building. Another often overlooked statistic is that green plants, chlorophyll, is the single largest source of terrestrial oxygen production. And certainly plants are a significant tool in the effort to sequester carbon. It's very difficult not to take a peek at the old fourth grade slide about photosynthesis and not have developed a healthy understanding for how miraculous plants are in the effort to remove carbon from the atmosphere and release oxygen. And in the heat reduction realm, hard surface, artificial turf, as you see in many places out west, we're seeing artificial turf deployed as an alternate to natural turf grass, living turf grass. We see heat gains in those scenarios, and sometimes that heat gain can be as much as 70 degrees on an artificial surface versus a natural surface. Plants are nature's air conditioner as well. They prevent erosion, sedimentation. Certainly, when plants are healthy, they're not providing the kind of fuel for a fire that you see in certain areas. And obviously, there are plenty of places for recreation to take place, that recreational opportunity. Wildlife habitat. And once, hydrologic cycle enhancement, Buddy put it very well when he said protecting our water resources with those natural buffers around them. And certainly, if we play our cards right, we can actually improve water quality. Speaking specifically to the topic of efficiency, water use efficiency in the landscape for many means different things, but in my mind, and in most folks' mind that I rub elbows with at the national and international level, efficiency is merely the ratio of the amount of water that's applied in an effort to keep the landscape healthy versus what's used beneficially by the plant. How are landscape irrigation systems most frequently managed? Well, quite frankly, many times they are most frequently managed by visual symptoms. If you look at the image here on the lower right, where we are at, you will see the big brown donut around that sprinkler. Look at this densogram here on the left, you will see an indication of what the sprinkler pattern or uniformity is, that array of sprinklers. And certainly, folks manage irrigation systems specifically to maintain the visual appearance that they'd like to have. Irrigation systems are programmed to water those weak areas of coverage because people are looking for a desired result. Compensating for poor design and uniformity becomes a long-term management challenge for us involved in the service side of this industry. How do you compensate for those areas and deliver the result that the consumer is looking for when distribution uniformity? I would suggest that in the lower right picture here you see a depiction of what happens when there is too low of pressure applied to a sprinkler. So how do we identify these problems and how do we maintain our system in good operating order? Well, on the lower left here you'll see a clear indication that there's a problem with that sprinkler system. Hard not to laugh when you see things like that, but unfortunately, many times issues like this go unattended to for days and days and days. And while that sprinkler at the top of that big heap of sod there is actually only supposed to put out maybe a gallon or 1.2 gallons per minute, because of that leak underneath there, it's potentially, there could be 15, 20, 30 gallons a minute leaking at that location, and that might go on for days and days and days. I will just share with you an experience I had going back and forth to a show in Orlando, Florida, 3 years running, where the same spray head at the same fast food restaurant was broken for 3 years in a row. And I believe when I go back in October again this year, I bet you anything that I find that same problem there. So I guess if we don't check those systems regularly for obvious problems, they can go unattended to and create serious water loss for some periods of time. But when we want to take a look at how uniform the system is applying water, we go through a process called an irrigation audit. An irrigation audit at regular intervals can certainly provide some significant feedback to the system operator and the system manager. It provides some clues as to where, in fact, we can maybe improve our efficiencies and deliver the result that the customer is looking for with a little bit less water. Specifically down to the gadgets and the gizmos here that can save a great deal of water, I'll start first with on board in the sprinkler itself, and there are some of these devices that can go into the circuit piping themselves. Check valves. Any property that has some sort of a subtle undulation in grade change or slope certainly should have inserted in the sprinklers themselves or somehow the ability to check that water flow and prevent that from draining out in between cycles. Circuit piping, particularly in large commercial systems, can contain significant amounts of water. And over the course of the season, if a system shuts down, and you look at the picture on the right here and the one in the center, you will see how that water is just slowly blubbering out of those sprinklers. Well, what happens is the lateral pipe completely drains out, and each time the system actuates, that water all has to be refilled before the desired result, i.e. sending water to the landscape, occurs. That means that we are wasting that water in between cycles each time the system cycles. Well, if you're on a 3-day per week or a 5-day per week schedule, that can become a significant amount of water over time. On the left here, you'll see a picture of one manufacturer's solution. It's just a rubber disc that goes right in the bottom of the sprinkler itself, that each time the system shuts down and the sprinkler pops back into its case, the sprinkler is then sealed off and that lateral pipe drainage no longer occurs. It's a very simple solution. 50 cents, $1, $1.50 maybe as an option in a sprinkler can save tremendous amounts of water over time. Certainly this also prevents the erosion of newly seeded areas from that low head drainage or even some of the existing landscapes. And a typical residential landscape irrigation system holds about 60 gallons of water according to my calculations. And you just think about that over time. 60 gallons of water is enough water to serve the average person's drinking and sanitation needs for a day. Depending on how many times you cycle the system during the season, you can save that much water each time the system cycles. Drip irrigation. This is certainly something that is underutilized in many areas of the country. There are many opportunities to use the advancements here in the field of drip irrigation. Drip irrigation offers flexible output. There are pressure compensating options that will help you deal with these elevation changes and maintain a uniform output. The water itself is applied directly where it's needed, when it's needed, without watering in between plants and creating weed patches unnecessarily. If this application, well, it's difficult to determine uniformity. It may not be an issue with drip irrigation because in many cases you can mix plants with differing needs if you use those flexible emitters or flexible output and apply the amount of water that's necessary depending on the tree species, shrub species, or the canopy size itself. It's low volume in most cases, and so oftentimes it makes a much less stress on the overall flow rates of overall municipal systems. And it offers a broader water window because there's usually no interference because the water is applied at grade or out of sight, out of mind. You don't have to worry about maintaining pedestrian access, for example. And there's limited contact with water, which also affords some opportunity to use some of the non-potable resources that Tom will talk about a little bit later in the presentation. Nozzle performance. This is an area where we have seen significant advancement. Talk specifically to a few in enhancing our ability to match precipitation. In other words, delivering water uniformly. When we have areas with mixed arc patterns and mixed distances and so forth, it's important to have nozzles that actually conform to what the need is. And then also be able to work within the array of sprinklers as they are laid out so that that water continues to be applied uniformly. So, for example, if a sprinkler has a 90-degree pattern and there's one adjacent to it that has a 180-degree pattern, it's important that that sprinkler with a 180-degree pattern have a similar arc pattern, a similar distance in its throw, in its radius, but put out roughly twice the amount of water so that we are watering. And every manufacturer has options available to help match precipitation within the zones. Additionally, we've come up with so many different patterns to hit these irregularly shaped areas and very small areas. The industry has really innovated in this area and come up with everything from corner side strips to end strips to center strips to you name it. It is just amazing how the industry has come up with some solutions here inserted into your particular application and maintain the water, uniform application of that water in the area where it's needed and prevent overspray into areas unnecessarily. Pressure regulation. As I alluded to a little bit earlier, in addition to having low pressure problems, high pressure can be a problem as well. Well, it's very neat to see some of these sprinklers operate at very high pressure. It's important to understand that each sprinkler has a sweet spot in a pressure band where it actually performs at its peak operation. It's important that if that pressure is too high, you will end up with a situation where the water atomizes as it exits the nozzle, and it will drift. It's much more susceptible to drift. The droplet size becomes much smaller, and the water ends up going in places where it was never intended to go. And certainly it also affords for some odd occurrences up and down a lateral pipeline when you have high pressure at one end and low pressure at the remote end of the lateral pipeline. Pressure regulation devices are available within the sprinklers themselves, at the control valves, in line for the entire system. But certainly, if high pressure is an issue, pressure regulation affords a wonderful opportunity to prevent these significantly higher flow rates caused by high pressure, and certainly helps with the distribution uniformity out of each sprinkler by maintaining a reasonable amount of pressure or within the manufacturer's specified design parameters. Understanding the site is critical to distribution uniformity. Every irrigation system represents a unique systems integration process, and every site has varying soil slopes exposure. Plant water needs certainly vary over time, depending on the species, size, etc. Some inherited problems are difficult to resolve. Oftentimes you'll walk into a situation where an irrigation system was installed 5, 10, 15 years ago, where it's very difficult to sell a customer on a remedy or a solution to a problem that's been there for some time. But certainly it's worthy of at least having the conversation with the customers, or even within your own management team or on your own system. Some of these problems just need to be repaired, and they need to be blocked sprinklers. The other day on the 4th of July, I walked right past a sprinkler head in a public park where a garbage can had been set down right directly in front of it. Big dry spot on the backside, big wet spot right next to the sprinkler. These are things that can be simply fixed by moving that garbage can. And it may seem like sometimes it's like an act of Congress to resolve them, but it doesn't mean that they're not worth working on. There is no substitute for a regular site visit, as I showed in the illustration earlier with the broken spray head and the big humped up sod bubble. If you're not walking the site regularly, it's very difficult to maintain any level of system operation that is efficient. You need to be seeing these sprinklers operate at regular intervals just for an inspection and just to pay attention, and why not do it in July during Smart Irrigation Month? No substitute for hands-on management. And certainly, customer input is critical to understanding the desired outcome. Customers know what they want, but we only know if we ask them what exactly it is that they want. Some folks really don't mind watching their grass turn a little bit dormant in the summertime if they understand that this is actually part of a natural process where the plant is actually shutting itself down during a drought stress period. Some folks want to keep it green. Once again, you don't know unless you ask. But make no mistake, The technology that we've spoken about here is not a substitute for prudent planning, proper spacing and application, correct pipe sizing, proper hydrozoning, proper installation, and the list goes on and on and on. Make sure that you cover the basics before you start to jump into the more complex. And with that, I will kick it to my colleague, Brent Meekum.